Thank you everyone for joining. For background, I'm Christine Robinson. I'm someone who has spent essentially my entire career in the accounting space, though I'm not actually an accountant myself. However, accountants and accounting firms hold a very special place in my heart, as I've worked within the resource management space at these firms for a number of years. And because of that, I've had somewhat of a unique perspective into a lot of the trends and themes that seem to impact those organizations. And it's interesting because one of the most intriguing ones at the moment is what's happening in the talent market right now. We have certainly experienced as an industry quite a bit of disruption in recent years, of course, during the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, the great resignation, the war for talent, and this huge rise in popularity in leveraging third party or offshore models for staffing. But it seems that today something even more complex is happening, which is it seems that all these things seem to be happening at once. And so what we're hearing in the accounting space is that talent is hard to come by. But in the same breath, we're also hearing that firms are somewhat overstaffed or experiencing higher retention rates. And it begs the question, what is really going on? So I wanted to know the answer to that question. And I have with me today two people who are going to help us understand that and really give some perspective around what to do and what they've seen. So we have Andrew Bone, chair and co-founder of Dayshape, as well as Mark Edmondson, CEO and president at Inflo. Andrew, Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Christine.
So really excited about this topic and certainly somewhat interested in what's going on here with the talent market today. But before getting into tactics for combating some of these challenges, I'd love to discuss and get your perspective on how firms attract talent in the first place. So presumably they're having to start from somewhere. And if they're struggling at that early stage, I'm curious, what have you seen work well here? Any thoughts on that? Andrew, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll kick off. So I think one thing that we do all recognize and we hear from our customers and other firms we speak to is that sadly, perhaps, but the profession of accountancy doesn't necessarily carry the same weight that it maybe did 20 years ago when there's all kinds of tech startups and other huge and interesting companies that new graduates can go and work for. So it's still very much maybe a safe choice, but it's not necessarily as attractive as it once was. And I think that's true on both sides of the pond, but for maybe slightly different reasons, which we'll get into. So I think really it's about being able to tell that story of what being in the accountancy world can do for your career. And that certainly going back 20 years now was why I joined the profession. Wasn't so much because I was desperate to become an accountant, but more because I saw it as a really useful business education. So what that means to me, I think is you've got to be able to tell that good story about what joining the profession can do for your career, but you've also then got to be able to back that up in reality. So once people get in the door and they are put to work on client engagements, making sure that your team and those new graduates really get that learning and that development that you've sold them on. I guess that would be in a nutshell for me. I think a huge benefit and a huge strength of the profession that it still very much has going for it is that ability to get exposure to lots of different kinds of businesses, lots of different industries, and it can be a real stepping stone that can take you almost anywhere into business leadership positions, into industry, as well as obviously staying and progressing in public accounting.
Yeah,
so it opens up so many doors.
Sense.
That's a huge selling point.
It's interesting. And part of that is this perspective on accounting being one of the few professions that still heavily does recruit on campus and people stay, at times, at least within that profession. Mark, do you agree with that perspective?
Yeah, I think it's interesting the way we're talking about it as well. We're talking about the whole profession trying to attract talent here. And I think one of the things that certainly the last number of years has presented is more of an opportunity for firms to differentiate themselves from others. We are competing for talent as a profession for people to come into accountancy rather than to go into law or to go into technology, for example. But also within that, firms are able to more greatly differentiate now, I believe, than they have been able to historically. So And we've seen some really interesting approaches from some firms that we work with who are, for example, trying to differentiate in terms of what that career pathway is going to look like if a candidate chooses their firm rather than choosing a firm that's maybe taking a more traditional approach. What is the impact going to be of technology? Are they a company that is investing in technology to be able to benefit the work experience for people that are joining? Or are they somewhat of a laggard and adopting a more traditional approach? So opportunities there, I think, to really bring to life what a career within a firm is going to look like, and an opportunity for you to really sell yourselves as a firm to be able to really stand out.
That makes sense. And it's interesting too, the idea of standing out, because it seems that not only are firms in general and as a profession, as an industry, up against that challenge to bring people in the first place, but the idea also of differentiating oneself as a firm also very much comes into play once people are within the organization, right? So once they have the talent, it seems sometimes the real challenge is actually keeping the talent, right? So driving those retention rates, and what does that look like from an employee engagement standpoint? It's interesting then, thinking about the disruption and what's been happening in the talent market. I'm curious then, what are your thoughts on how accounting firms can keep people engaged, and actually what's worked well? So both of you have this unique vantage point because you do work within this space, but you work with many different firms, and I'm certain you see a lot of different approaches. So Andrew, I'm curious, any thoughts on this?
I think, and I guess the other aspect we have is that we also hire a lot of people into our company. So one thing I would say is that there's a generational expectation that differs maybe from the days when Mark and I worked in the Big Four. I think there is an expectation, or even a demand, that people have coming into the workforce of the younger generation, that they want to have opportunities presented to them. They want to have those learning and growth opportunities. They want to have a variety in their work. And the sort of maybe traditional career of basically go in and slog away at this task for 3 years, and then you'll be at this level, and then do that a bit longer, and then maybe you'll be a senior, and work your way up the pyramid, but it's going to take you a long time. That isn't necessarily that appealing. So I think the journey to get there has to be more engaging, in order to retain your best people. To me, that means giving them more ability to have a say in what they work on, having more flexibility, not necessarily full autonomy. Obviously you've got work to be delivered for a client, and you couldn't just have chaos of everyone doing exactly what they wanted. There's always going to be some things that people don't want to do. But I think having staff feeling like they're being listened to, that their preferences and that their personal development plans matter, and that they are taken into consideration when you're planning out the work. I think that can really help, just to build engagement and make sure they're enjoying the work they're doing, and make sure that they are kind of committed to that, and they're always going to do better work as well in those circumstances.
Yeah. That's interesting. And I can attest to that, as well, in my own experience of being in the resource manager seat. A lot of times you're hearing about things that folks are not necessarily telling the partner, or, coming out necessarily in the exit interview. So it's that balance between, yes, we have a business to run and we have client deliverables that need to take place, but at the same time, is there a way to make this a learning experience, or carve something out to be more along the lines of what someone's career aspirations are? And I think that's interesting. Mark, I'm curious, from your standpoint, does that resonate with you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what there's an opportunity right now in the market. There's a lot of talk around things like, for example, the impact of AI. What is AI going to mean for the future of the accounting profession? And if we, as those more experienced people in the profession, look back at some of the earlier stages of our career, I don't think we have that same need for that same rite of passage. There's a lot of things that we used to do that are very automatable at this point in time. And so how can we really focus on taking out those things that, let's be frank, we wouldn't have done if we didn't have to in those early days. You know, how many times did we basically look at one piece of paper and write down in a spreadsheet what was on that piece of paper, which, to be quite candid, is not the most valuable or strongest learning experience we'll ever come across. And how do we try and create a richer learning environment for people at the very start of their careers and bring them in from colleges, from universities, when they're at their kind of highest passion and enthusiasm, and really let them hit the ground running with something that's a much more exciting, engaging, and a rewarding experience, so as those people don't just come into the profession, they stay longer term as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, and that's where I'm very excited about some of the potential opportunities to try and really tackle head on some of those things that really do disengage and disenfranchise some really talented people when they join the accounting profession.
You touched upon something really, really interesting, and I think a huge pain point, not only for firms, but for the industry as a whole, because that's exactly right in terms of the trends. People are seeing that, they're feeling that, and they're also seeing their friends in different industries not experiencing some of those challenges. And so that's a very real pain point. I'm curious then, Mark, from what you've seen working with clients in different parts of the world, presumably of different sizes as well, do you see a difference in that, and specifically in how they are engaging talent and approaching talent retention? Is there anything that's worked well? Are there any notable trends from that standpoint?
One of the things I've certainly noticed of recent, Christine, has been how national and regional accounting firms are trying to replicate some of the selling points of some of the larger firms and larger networks. So myself and Andrew both joined PwC at the start of our careers, and some of the things that are very attractive beyond just the name on your CV is things like the mobility opportunities you have. You know, you can very quickly and easily go on secondments. I worked in England, but I also worked in the US, I worked in Canada, I traveled all over to be able to really build quite an exciting career path for myself. And smaller national, regional, independent firms can sometimes replicate elements of that through a network, but sometimes that can be quite challenging. And what we've seen is that some of our customer firms who are using our same audit platform, same audit methodology, are starting to create more informal relationships. But we've actually had one firm in the UK agree a secondment partnership with a firm in Australia to be able to exchange staff just between the two of them, because they've acknowledged that they want to be able to offer that kind of experience to their staff. But they work and live in one city in London. And on the flip side, they're working with a firm in Sydney who works in basically one city. And how can they create an experience there that can replicate something like what the Big Four can do, but at the same time protecting some of the real things that they do far better than a Big Four firm can do in terms of, you know, their staff's involvement and participation in their workload, their resource planning, etc. So I think what we're starting to see is that prestige around the Big Four and some of the things, when you start to unpack that in terms of what is attractive for an employee coming into the profession going, I want to work for the Big Four. Well, really, there's a lot of downsides to working for the Big Four. Can I get some of those upsides from a smaller firm that's perhaps got some really exciting upsides to it as well?
Really, really interesting perspective. Andrew, are you seeing something similar as well?
Yeah, well, just to add to that, and it was actually something I saw one of our customers doing a couple of weeks ago, was running in-person days where they were getting all the staff who were new joiners to the firm to come in, regardless of level as well. So obviously, I'm sure it was heavily weighted towards the more junior ranks, but even so, there would be more experienced people there as well. Getting them in on a monthly basis to make sure there was they were building that community, that loyalty to the firm, as well as, again, really helping with the education side of that you otherwise might miss if you're working remotely all the time. And yeah, just another idea that we've seen people do, but makes sense, and we do similar things within Dayshape itself.
Yeah, I'd like to tease that out a bit more, because I think that there is somewhat of a misconception around in person, not in person, getting together, and what does it mean and what's the value, really specifically around the purpose of getting together. And so if you open up LinkedIn or any, social media or news channel, you'll see a lot of chatter around the, return to office and hybrid and what does that mean. But really, as it relates to employee engagement, it does seem that there is a strategic play around that. And I think you both touched upon that. So I think it's worth highlighting that, at least from my standpoint, what I'm noticing is that people aren't necessarily averse to coming in general, but they want to know that it's for a reason, right? They having a defined and intentional purpose for that, whether it's collaboration, whether it's to learn together, I think goes a long way. And it seems sometimes we fall short of that and we don't necessarily communicate that purpose, right? So perhaps that's a practical takeaway as well, is explaining to people what we're trying to achieve and in bringing folks together.
I think that's a great point, Christine. It's about being really intentional about that. And we, Inflow, we don't have any offices at all. We're 100% remote workforce. But when we try and get people together, we're firstly very clear on whether this is something that's an optional attendance or there's an expectation. I think that's firstly very important because people need to travel. People need to understand what your expectations are of the team. And we also then try and make sure that when we are getting the team together, there's a real clear intent around that. So we have a quarterly all hands meeting, right? Everybody that's within the local area, we would expect you to be there. Once a year, we're going to get the whole team together from around the world. Now, we're not necessarily representative of an accounting firm. But what we're doing is we're being very intentional and saying we want people to get together. This is why we want them to get together. There's a social element, there's a joint learning element, there's a collaboration networking across the organization element. But I would recommend being really clear on intention. What are we going to do? And expectation around hybrid really is difficult. Having half the team in person and half of them virtual is a recipe for a really unproductive session. So trying to be clear on what you want to get out of the time can be really helpful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the other thing that you talked about too, and kind of looping back to your earlier comment around secondments and other things that firms are doing, it's interesting because for so long, Big Four had such a hold, right, on the talent market because of those things. And so I'm curious from the perspective of now an accounting firm, maybe that finds themselves in a similar position and they're looking to up the ante a bit and try to compete with some of those other firms that are in that bucket. What do you have to share with them around how to implement that, right? Because one thing is the concept around it. It sounds great. We'd love to participate in that. We'd love to offer our people these opportunities. However, the very real challenge is that it is sometimes very difficult to implement some of that stuff, right? Are you seeing any processes or tools, or is there anything that you would suggest in terms of making some of that easier?
Well, without sounding too self-serving on this one, Christine, what we found was that the consistency in how the work is being performed was one of the key drivers for that. So what you want to be able to do if you want to explore something like secondments, and we're touching on this here, but that's just maybe one element of this that could replicate a Big Four environment. What you don't want is that for a 6-month secondment, the first 2 months is the new team member getting up to speed with how you work and how you're performing your services. So what I'd very much be indicating would be the more consistent that your way of working is to the partner firm, the quicker you're going to be able to ramp an employee to work in your way versus our way. So the two firms that we were working with, they're using the same audit methodology, they're using the same audit platform, they've got a very consistent process around that. So they felt very comfortable that they could interchange staff very quickly and there wouldn't be very much of a lead time at all. So that would be one thing I'd recommend. That's obviously easier if you're part of an international network, because you'll have probably a stronger alignment in your methodology or your processes and your technologies that you're using. So that could be one aspect of it. Other things would just be more generally like the understanding you have of how to set something up like this or how to go about it. So if you've never done it before, maybe speak to somebody who has done this before to be able to get their practical insights. Maybe they've got some templates around the arrangements that they put in place with the other firm or things like that. So that would be all the practical tips around something like secondments, but there's probably also some other easier, quicker wins that you might want to explore to be able to say, how can we add some strings to our bow, shall we say, in terms of what are the selling points that candidates are asking us about at the stands? What is it that we feel like we're behind on other bigger firms who are in this space? And how can we maybe be more creative with our overall compensation or remuneration packages? Because blindly competing with the big four on salary is probably not the right approach on this one. How can you be more creative around the things that you want to offer people that's really aligned with what people want at this point in time?
I'd say, just building on that, I think Mark's point is a great one around, sharing resources across different firms to give that really broad experience. But honestly, we've seen, even with quite large firms that are, for example, large US national firms, I think the same point applies, as in, if different offices or different states are all working in very different ways, which is often the case, then it makes it very challenging to I guess give people that broader experience, because it's almost effectively like lots of separate little businesses operating within a large one. So yeah, there's definitely that point around aligning with a completely different firm, but I would say even within firms, there is often a lot to be desired in terms of internal processes within the same firm, or within different service lines within the firm. And it can end up feeling, this is what you don't want to happen, but it can end up feeling like almost as difficult for a staff member to move to a different service line as it is for them to just move to an entirely different company. And in that case, then, you're at risk of losing people.
I couldn't agree more. And I'll add yet another perspective to that, which is we are, in general, I think some of the private equity deals are absolutely pushing, that direction as well. But in general, seeing this theme around the consolidation of the accounting industry. So regardless of what might be the underlying factor there, we're certainly seeing a lot of merger activity, acquisition activity, firms becoming larger, sometimes organically and sometimes through very strategic growth, right? That they're looking to achieve from combinations. And that is a huge point there, because you're not only bringing together people, but differentiated processes and all kinds of tools, right? That might need to be, reevaluated. The other really key piece here that I'd add, and one that I've seen in my own career has been a challenge, is also the evaluation of talent. So if that's not done consistently, even throughout an organization, that can become very challenging in terms of sharing resources, cross-utilizing professionals, because again, you want to understand even from the personal standpoint what you're going into, right? And so I do think that I'm a big believer in consistency, but not just for the sake of consistency. I think it needs to have a really defined and appropriate purpose. But that being said, using that to leverage the opportunity to then be able to be nimble with your people is going to be huge, and absolutely plays into the talent attraction and the talent retention piece as well. On that point, we've covered quite a bit. I want to encourage folks to, if you have questions, we're open to that. Please go ahead and put them into the Q&A. Going to pivot a little bit, because we touched somewhat on the process. I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about technology, right? Because we're seeing that technology is certainly a red thread kind of across these areas. It's certainly a huge hot topic just in general, even outside of accounting. I know I just started using ChatGPT myself, and I'm not really a technology person. And so there's a lot of people that are starting to explore and experiment with some of this stuff. And in the professional realm, absolutely, in the accounting space, automation and how that's saving time and what that means. I think there's some fear surrounding that, and there's some confusion as well. What can we share with the attendees around how firms are using technology? Are they really saving time? What are they doing with the time that they're saving? And how, if at all, does that have an impact on talent? Curious, I'll go to you, Mark, for your perspective first.
Well, first off, I would put a word of caution in the sense of don't necessarily be too concerned about the big grand press releases that come out of some of the big four firms in terms of how much money they're spending on generative AI and other things like that. Those statements can be quite off-putting for people who are looking at this in national, regional, smaller firms and thinking, do I really need to spend $1 billion or $2 billion to be able to start using AI? What I'd say is that there's a lot of experimentation going on right now, and there's some enthusiasm around certain different parts of that process. 2 seconds. There's a lot of experimentation, a lot of enthusiasm going on across the sector. Where that's going to be actually having some really tangible impact is up for debate at this point in time. I think there's naturally, in accounting, different services will take to this in different ways. So, for example, an audit service, which is highly regulated, and there's a very high threshold in terms of the reperformability of something, means that it's going to be more challenging to identify holistic and big impact use cases. There are going to be some, but it's going to have a slightly higher bar to clear. So what I'm really striving to see and hear from firms right now is the specific examples of specific tasks that time has been saved from using these techniques. At the moment, a lot of the coverage is very theoretical, very intangible, very difficult to actually tease out, okay, so what do I do with that and how could that help? I think we're starting to see some of that breakthrough a little bit. There's been some coverage. We've been experimenting ourselves, some areas where we're starting to identify, okay, maybe it could help in this particular area. But a lot of it's around the bluster around generative AI and ChatGPT specifically. And what it's actually more important to think about is what is the task that we're trying to improve here, rather than how can we use this functionality? More, how do we look at what's being done end to end here to perform this service? And it might not be that ChatGPT or generative AI is actually the right answer for this particular problem. There's all sorts of different shades of AI. There's all sorts of other techniques that are often more suitable, like data analytics or RPA or all these other things. So what I'd like to see as a profession is a little bit more focus on the impact, the use cases, the application. And I think a lot of that is going to come when vendors like Dayshape, Inflow, and others are really embedding that into the core workflows of products, and accountants can just naturally access these capabilities. Whereas at the moment, a lot of it's, shall we say, cottage industry type innovation work that's being done to one side. It's not core business, it's experimentation, and we need to see it really embedded into the core workflow for it to have a really big impact. But a lot of potential, a lot of excitement, and certainly one that I know a lot of people are investing very hard in right now, Christine.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think every software company out there at the minute is saying things like, oh, the platform's underpinned by AI, or stamping a badge of AI on it, which frankly is kind of meaningless. So I would definitely encourage everyone to be skeptical about it, and actually, to Mark's point, think about what's it actually going to do from a business value point of view. I would say, bringing it back to talent, the other piece is that technology in general changes the expectations of new talent coming into the business. So people are used to a certain quality of experience when it comes to technology in their personal lives. And so if you suddenly come into business as a new grad and you're faced with a piece of technology that's older than you are, potentially, it doesn't necessarily create that sort of impression that you're going to want as an employer. And I also think it could create a generational divide between people who think, oh yeah, this is just the way we've always done things, and yes, it takes us this long, but that's just how we do it, versus new talent coming into the industry saying, well, why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense. Why would we waste all that time when there's got to be a better way? So I think technology has an important part to play, and it's not obviously I would say this, but I've heard CIOs say this at firms to me, that technology plays an important part in their employer brand. and making sure their employees have a good experience that matches their expectations from their personal life.
That is a huge point too, and I think that I can't help but draw that comparison from the campus perspective that we talked about at the opening of our conversation. Is people are coming in with certain expectations of what something should look and feel like, and having that disparity is likely not a positive as a first impression. So that's a huge, I think that's a great point. We've touched upon a couple of different things. So higher level, we've talked about some philosophical, so to speak, concepts, and the tech perspective. Is there any practical advice that you can offer for people at firms who are interested in this, but they're not necessarily in that place where they're going to completely revolutionize the process? Is there something that they can do right away, something that they can implement that's really a little bit more tactical, and can kind of help move the needle?
Yeah, some real practical advice I would suggest to people. My background is very biased towards the audit side of the business, but this can apply to any other area. What we generally are seeing is that as firms, particularly on recurring engagements from year to year, as we bring in more technology, as we bring in more automation, more outsourcing, just generally we're changing the mix of the way things are done. The more you can plan upfront, i.e. you can spend more time planning an engagement, a service, a project, whatever, the more that the execution is going to be both more efficient and more effective. And so when you're looking at resource planning, resource management, how can you look at last year's planner and try and bring some of that work forward earlier? And that's really advantageous in something like audit, because what you're going to do is in essence shave off some of the peak of busy season. We all know that busy season is almost a term everybody knows before they've even entered the accounting profession, and they all dread it. How can we start to bring more of that work forward and really come up with the most effective and efficient way of delivering this work in the right time frame? So try and think about bringing that work forward. Maybe it needs slightly more senior people sometimes to be involved in that planning work, because a couple of hours of a senior team member at the start could save days of time towards the execution phase. Involve partners in that as well. Make sure that they're part of that early planning process as well, because again, some of the decisions that they could make in a matter of minutes might actually cause hours or days of time to be lost across the project. And also, one of the things that I used to see was a really kind of rigid mindset around either it was a 1 week, it was a 2 week, or it was a 3 week audit. And so everybody got booked to that particular client based on those parameters. And, if you're going to save 20% of the time across a 1 week audit, well, you only need 4 days of time now rather than 5, but people would still book the 5 days worth of time because, well, it's either going to be 1 week or 2 week, right? So how can we maybe think about this in a more agile approach where we can be more specific and more granular, say, well, hang on, if we want to actually, pocket the benefits of the investments that we've made in technology, or the changes that we've made in the outsourcing of our processes, or just generally, we need to save 10% of time across the board. Well, we need to think a little bit more specific and granular around how we actually go about resource planning for that. And so those would be some things that, even today or tomorrow, you could sit down and think about, how do we bring more of this work forward? How can we maybe rephase these engagements a little bit? What would that mean in terms of the mix of staff that we need to deliver this particular assignment? And how can we unlock some more capacity from the existing team that we've got by being more targeted and more specific in how we're allocating resource?
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I mean, a lot of what you're saying there, Mark, I think is essentially about the resource management function having a bit more clout or a bit more of a say, and adding strategic value to be asking some of those exact questions.
Or having one if you don't have one.
Yeah, and having it if you don't have one, exactly. So what I think Christine and I couldn't be more aligned on is that concept of investing in and elevating the resource management role, because I think we hugely believe that in a professional services firm, it's so fundamental. I think in terms of just a practical thing, one thing that we do still see a lot of, even in big firms that you would be surprised to see this, is still a lot of silos in terms of either different service lines or even different teams within service lines or different geographies. Ultimately, when it comes to trying to give your staff the most opportunity, as well as, you know, not burning them out by having them working crazy hours, that the larger pool of people that you can be planning across, the better. You're going to see more opportunities to say, well, that this team is really slammed right now, they're super busy, but that team actually has capacity. We could balance things out here, and not being so rigid in both the processes, but also in the mindset of having to kind of draw strict limits around the resource pool. So I would say that is something, it's not something you can necessarily do today, tomorrow, but it's something you can do relatively quickly, is start to work more across a larger, more joined up approach to your resource management. And I think that can have huge benefits, not only financially for the firm, but also to the employee experience. And at the end of the day, I think the resource management of a firm, whether it's done by a resource manager or just it's part of a partner's role or whatever, how people are resource managed has a massive impact in their employee experience and therefore potentially whether they'll stick around with the firm.
Agree. Yeah, that's a huge one. And bringing together what you both said, I have seen for years now, and it's definitely somewhat coming to a head, that the ROI for resource management, and from resource management rather, has never been higher, because with the advent of so many tools and technology solutions that can really can have a significant impact on the way that the work is done, really the lack of planning is the biggest drawback of that, because you're not really then putting yourself in a position to take advantage of those solutions or to forecast appropriately. So the other thing that I would add here is the huge benefit of true workforce planning. And I think that I've seen firms sometimes shy away from that because historically they haven't necessarily had to rely on that, because they've had somewhat predictable forecasts in terms of when the work was being done. But it's interesting, and the same hand that they're investing in AI solutions and automation and time saving, you also need to carry that through and ensure that, Mark, to your point, that's actually happening, right? So our schedules being adjusted to reflect that, is hiring being adjusted to reflect that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That doesn't mean that people should not be, coming into the profession, but rather people should be coming in and actually gaining the benefit of doing something really interesting and actually learning a new and more innovative way of approaching the work, and having a bit more of a holistic perspective around what's going on in the industry. So I think that's huge. I would also very much say that the benefits don't necessarily stop there, right? Because if we're thinking about not just the process and the tools that are being used, but also the ability to forecast, thinking about what's in pipeline and making really clear recommendations on hiring. So going back to our conversation around campus recruiting, and perhaps broadening the traditional pool of campus recruiting, because, one of the things, Andrew, that you said at the start of our conversation is how accounting really, it's not just about accounting, but it's business, right? It really gives a strong foundation for people in general in the business world to understand operationally how things work. And so I would venture to say that anyone could probably stand to benefit from that. The other thing that I would say too is capacity planning. We touched upon that a bit, thinking about skill sets and which skills are needed, and really drawing that together with, Mark, your point around secondments. The other thing that I would say is, for folks that might be listening that are finding themselves in a position where they're like, yeah, that sounds amazing, but our firm is just not ready for that, I would venture to say, and actually challenge you back respectfully, but challenge you back to say that really your firm might not be ready for a huge secondment process, but may very well be ready for a smaller scale rotational process internally. And, if you've got different service lines, if you've got different regions, practices that perhaps draw upon similar skill sets, you can put together a rotational program, and it doesn't take that elaborate of a solution to be able to put that together. So just a thought there. And I would say too, we talked a little bit more about from the talent perspective, what are some of those benefits? Can you give me some perspective? And I'll go over to you, Mark, on how can some of that protect people from burnout? So we talked about what that can do in terms of attracting talent. We talked about retaining the talent. From a burnout perspective, do you see anything from your vantage point around either moving work around differently, or what can you tell us about that?
So I think one of the things that I think is a product or a function of various things that we've already talked about here is that if we're able to take, shall we say, some of the automation opportunities that are most prevalent and maybe at the lower parts of the pyramid structure, how can we, rather than thinking that we don't need junior staff members anymore, which I've seen some social coverage to suggest such ridiculous plans, how do we actually think about how we can push work down the pyramid? So a lot of the time we see the burnout is actually when people are some way through their career, they're at the manager level or the in charge or senior level, and they're getting pressure from those above them to be able to execute and deliver on the work, and they're getting pressure from beneath them for the support, coaching, development side of things. So how can we use this as an opportunity? Maybe the automation impact isn't going to hit that manager level or that decision-making level. How can we delegate and elevate the rest of the team beneath them to be able to really give them more exciting work to advance, but also to really help where that burnout often sits? And the other bit would be being creative around what talent we have in the business. So we've seen some many accounting firms that we work with are using the opportunity of more advanced platforms to start thinking differently about their resource modeling. So maybe it's quite difficult to attract talent in some of the core markets that they're sitting in. One firm that comes to mind is a London-based firm, very competitive market. How can they create a separate branch or division in South Africa and start utilizing and blending some of that resource into the areas that they're feeling the most pressure on? And that's something that really, if you go back 5 years or so ago and you're using desktop tools and you're kind of using quite traditional dated processes, you couldn't even consider some of those ideas around how you could actually creatively solve this problem. But now you've got a lot more opportunity at your disposal. But fundamental to all of that is things like being better planned, understanding what your resource needs are. How many clients do I have? How much work does that represent? Therefore, how many team members do I need in these different places? And then having the tools and the platforms in place to be able to work across those teams really effectively as one coherent team, rather than, we've seen the old school way of outsourcing was throwing packets of work to India. Well, actually, let's think differently about that. How can we now be more creative and create a blended workforce here?
Yeah, we've seen firms do that at all levels, not obviously the large firms do it, but yeah, we've definitely seen that, just to echo Mark's point, that at smaller or more medium-sized firms as well. The other thing I would say, Christine, coming back to your point on burnout, is I think there's a lot of opportunity once you've got tools in place to use data around this. So you can see not only who's putting in the crazy hours, but who's scheduled to put in the crazy hours as well. It might be sustainable for a week or two, but it might not be sustainable for 6 months. So looking at that, and also looking at the kind of work that people are doing, I'm a big believer that burnout isn't just purely a number of hours worked thing. I think it also depends on your motivation and enthusiasm for that work. Working an 80-hour week of admin is very different from working a really engaging 80-hour week of client work that you get really excited about. It's a different thing entirely. So I think their technology has a role to play there to try and take away some of the grunt work and make sure that even if, and it will always happen that sometimes people have to put in long hours, they're sort of doing it for the right reasons that excite them rather than begrudgingly doing it.
And that's been a recurring theme, I think, in our conversation so far, which is that's certainly key. So I'll recap. We've touched upon a lot. I would say there's probably 4 main takeaways here as it relates to talent. One is absolutely a huge focus on campus recruiting, both in terms of messaging as well as broadening the pool of incoming hires from university, maybe outside of the traditional areas. We also talked about keeping people engaged, making a really deliberate and intentional effort to understand what they want, as well as creating forums for them to form relationships internally within your organization, leveraging technology, of course. But the one really interesting aspect here is not putting the cart before the horse and not letting the technology dictate, but rather understanding what is needed and how technology can help with that. So I thought that was a great perspective. And lastly, of course, investing in resource management, helping with earlier planning, opening your firm up to being a bit more creative in terms of the possibility of different staffing models. So I think with that, we can go ahead and wrap up. Andrew, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today. We've covered a lot. And to everyone who joined us, thank you. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Christine.